everybody still has, I've been cured of it, but has an incredible, maybe irrational fear of LDLC. How do you guys think, as a group or individually, how is that best to address? Is it about studies? Is it about, further evidence? There's so much evidence out there, but who's going to bring that up? And should I worry about my LDL-C going too low? It's 170, but I really would like to stay up high. And how can one raise it?
So yeah, I'll at least conquer it because this comes up a lot. So the question of LDL, the approach that I've taken with some audiences is, in order to change people's minds, you have to meet them where they're at. In order for people to listen to you, you have to validate their worth and their knowledge. You can't just spew venom at them. You stupid idiot, don't you know LDL isn't toxic? So number one, I would say, let's have a respectful conversation with an audience. If you actually want to change their mind, if you just want to yell at them and vent, I guess if that's your style, go for it. So in order to meet them where they're at and to try to actually change their mind, I need to validate. I know that you've heard LDL is toxic and bad for you. And the medical field has thought that for a long time. But if we go back to the 1970s and 80s, there was a time that we used to say cholesterol was bad for you. It was all lumped together. There was no LDL, there was no HDL, there was nothing else. It was cholesterol. And the medical field was certain at that time that they had it right. Cholesterol is bad for you. The higher, the worse. But it turned out that there were some people who had lowish or moderate levels of cholesterol having recurrent heart attacks. And then there were other people who had high levels of cholesterol that had perfectly clean arteries. And so the medical field couldn't explain that conundrum. And what we ultimately realized was that there are two types of cholesterol. And in reality, there are actually a lot of different types of cholesterol particles, but the medical field lumped it into two types of cholesterol, HDL and LDL. Oh, it turns out that HDL is actually good cholesterol. The higher, the better. And LDL is bad cholesterol, so the higher, the worse. And we use that simplistic kind of analogy or explanation. And what I say is the time has come. We have an abundance of evidence now that LDL can be sorted into at least 7 distinct types of particles, which all confer different levels of risk. Some of them are completely benign and neutral, might even have some beneficial effects, and others are unequivocally toxins. Unequivocally toxins. The small, dense LDL particles are unequivocally toxins. So I'm going to validate their perspective. You're right. Some types of LDL are toxic. And that's probably why the statins do work, is that the statins are reducing a lot of them, or why you think you've seen the statins work. So you validate that, but I would say the time has come. In the same way that we separated HDL from LDL, the time has come to separate LDL into different subfractionations in some clear way and assess risk in that way.
Yeah, I mean, my perspective as a surgeon is this, that my friend God is not trying to kill me. So therefore, LDL has to have an important, valuable role in my body. And the question is what? And ultimately what LDL, it's a complex molecule, or the lipid molecules are complex molecules. Chylomicrons transport fat from my gut into my fat cells. And LDL, VLDL, and IDL basically are barges that transport fat from my liver to my fat cells and around my body. It's a barge. It's a vehicle for fat in my body. And when you look at that barge, it can either be full or it can be empty. And an empty barge is the small dense particle. And the full particle is the big fluffy one that's full of fat is your LDLA, okay? That's simplistically. So how does that LDL molecule get filled up with fat? How does it get what it transports? Well, it's fat, it's triglycerides and cholesterol. So when we eat sugar and our liver converts sugar to fat, that fat is not very compatible with being transported in LDL. So that fat, that triglyceride, first of all, it fills up my liver, so I get a fatty liver every time I eat carbohydrates. And then the fat gets transported, combined to a globulin, which is a protein in my bloodstream, because it doesn't fit on that barge. The containers, the type of fat that LDL transports is not the type of triglyceride, probably palmitic acid, that comes from the conversion of sugar to fat. So that fat gets transported free in my bloodstream attached to a globulin, okay? And what's that called? That's called triglycerides. And we can measure triglycerides. So we know that triglycerides are associated with danger or with a higher cardiovascular risk. And that's because the triglycerides came from carbohydrates, and there's a specific method by which they cause injury. And under those conditions, I've got all this excess triglyceride in my bloodstream that's floating back and forth, but my barges are empty, so my particle size is small, it's not doing its job, and the triglycerides are floating around my bloodstream. Now when I eat fat, that complex animal fat is broken down or really transported in my body. It's not even broken down by the liver because it goes through chylomicrons directly into my blood system, straight to my fat cells. So that nice, good fat that I'm eating is compatible with transport in my LDL. So what happens is those small, dense, empty LDLs fill up with good fat, and the triglycerides don't need to be transported in my bloodstream. So my triglyceride count goes down, and my big fluffy LDLAs go up. And that is compatible with health. And all that LDL, I'm eating fat, so all that LDL is transporting fat back and forth from my fat cells, from my body cells, and from my liver cells. It's not that difficult. LDL is just a barge, it's just a transport molecule. It's the injurious effect of sugar by a completely different pathway on our endothelial cells and mediated through insulin that causes the problem. So we're telling God and nature that they're bad people because they're trying to kill us with something that is normal in the human body. It doesn't compute. So if you're on a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, ignore your LDL. It's doing its job. It's just a transport barge. Go down to Miami Harbor or Fort Lauderdale Harbor, and on a good day, there's going to be plenty of ships full of containers. And on another day, they're going to be empty and leaving the harbor. That doesn't mean it's a good or a bad thing. And that's how our body works. So we've got to get back to fundamental biology, and I kind of try to dumb it down to that point. Now, the other piece is, where is that LDL, that big fluffy LDL, transporting cholesterol and fat to? Why do I need fat and cholesterol? Yeah, I need it for energy. I need it for calories. But there's something else that's very important. 30% of the cell membrane structure in my brain is made of cholesterol. About a third of that is made inside my brain cells. The rest has to be transported there. Well, if I sink all the barges that are transporting cholesterol to my brain's not going to be able to repair itself to be able to grow and function properly. And over time, that disease is called type 3 diabetes or Alzheimer's, dementia, and Parkinson's disease. And that is a lack of saturated fat going to our brain. In developing babies, we call that autism and spectrum disorders. It's a structural white matter deficit in the brain. So LDL is doing a job not only in terms of energy transport, but also in molecular structural transport. And if you kill the LDL, if you sink all these LDL barges with a statin, what's happening to your brain? So that's I'm not a cardiologist, as I keep saying, I'm just a surgeon, but I'm not even talking as a surgeon. I'm just looking this through like so many of the biochemists that understand this pathway. And I'm happy to be corrected on that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's the company it keeps. You're seeing what neighborhood it's in. Like, that's why I tell my patients, look, if you can be mugged if you're in downtown LA at 2 a.m. in a bad neighborhood, or you're in this neighborhood at noon, your chance of getting mugged are a lot higher there. It can happen. That's what we have to tell people. Look, it can happen. I think we have a lot of data coming out. I think Dave Feldman has totally messed up my whole view of cholesterol. You step back and say, what the heck does that mean? You fast for 3 days and your LDL goes through the roof. You eat a bunch of fat and it goes down. It's like, okay, wait, that's the opposite. I personally did a pescatarian diet for a month to see what would happen. LDL goes up by 40 points. I'm doing the right thing and my LDL goes up. Why? Right? I was in a calorie deficit and I was losing weight, kicking fat into the tissue. Lean mass hyper responders. I think we're going to learn a lot. And at some point we may say, Dave's data may say, okay, if it's over 220, we start worrying. If it's over 204, we don't know. We don't know, but we know. What I do know is I don't want to have a lot of the small, dense LDL like they're talking about. So if I can watch my carbs, exercise, watch the stress level, all those things that we already know. Watch your stress, get enough sleep, don't eat terrible food, don't smoke, and you decrease your risk by 50%. I'll take that, right? And then some people are just gonna have bad luck.
Okay, so I just want to jump in here. Now Ignacio's back. Brian said he had a question for all the psychiatrists, you two and the rest of the psychiatrists in the room. So
Well, I have a question. A lot of times we say, okay, what's the healthiest diet? I want to live a long time. And so one thing I've noticed just on social media interactions, I've seen vegans be extremely venomous and attack some of the Sean Baker death threats and I hope your family dies and a few other people that have been out there. They've been getting, it's not natural, a natural response. Some of the leaders in the community, not everyone, I'm just saying. So do you think there's something along this line of LDL, super low fat diet, or like Dr. Ifland was talking about, like if we're going up and down with our sugars, is there something to that leading to some of this instability, or is there something already going on to go into that lifestyle? Does that make sense? And we have so many psychiatrists here, that would be good just to see if you're seeing that in your practice from in left field.
I don't have a definitive answer to that because it's a very wide question in fact, but there are many components on it. One of them being the strong ideology and the motives that they are doing it. One of the first thing I ask someone going on a vegan diet is, what are the reasons? Why are you doing it? Because if they are doing it because of health reasons, I try to improve that diet. Sure. And if it's for ethical reasons, there's not much to do because they have a strong opinion about that, and they are seeing everyone that's a carnivore diet or omnivorous diet are assassins. So if they think you are like a murderer, they are probably going to treat you like one.
Exactly.
And also I've seen a study of inmates, the most aggressive, and I don't know the validity of it, but I don't know if you're familiar with that study, that a correlation was seen, not a causation, but a correlation was seen among lower LDL levels and highest aggressive traits.
And higher sugar intake with aggressive traits also.
Yes,
Higher sugar,
yes,
we've
yes.
seen that also.
So it's a perfect storm for some of them. So those are two of the reasons that I can think of.
Well, and I think so. I think the other piece here is vegan doesn't help. It doesn't help you understand what's going on. Some people, in my experience, have gone vegan to cover a carbohydrate addiction. So it's like, chef, no, oh gosh, I'm gonna get into trouble here. Some people will go into professions dealing with food so that they can kind of have a rationale for being around food and overeating and so on. These are very powerful addictions, and they will drive careers, they will drive, and they do. They drive people into veganism because a candy bar is vegan. So sugar is vegan. And we do have some evidence that higher levels of protein in the bloodstream are more stabilizing. So if you want to get high off of your carbohydrates, then you don't want to eat too much protein because that will modulate it. And so I talked this afternoon or yesterday afternoon about unstable blood sugar and about the meltdowns and the irritability. I think if you're eating a refined carbohydrate diet, but you're actually calling it veganism, then you are experiencing those downregulated feel-good pathways in the brain, which we saw the pictures of yesterday morning. And you are an unhappy camper. But the brain, remember, the brain will not let you think you're crazy. So it's out there looking for rationalizations for why I am so angry, why I'm so irritable. It's those carnivores. Yeah. So there you go. I mean, that's another explanation.
I mean, they could definitely have nutritional deficiencies. That's clear and unequivocal. I think the big question is, you know, as Ignacio said, why did they start it? And I think we have to look at why, you know, what were they like before they started being a vegan, and then what are they like after, and is there really a significant change? I actually, I think, prefer Ignacio's suggestion about the moral righteousness. You know, there are a lot of anti-abortion advocates who also will make death threats against physicians, against women, against other people. And it's a little ironic that they don't want a fetus to die, yet they're willing to kill others. But they feel righteous in doing that because they think they're protecting an innocent living organism. And I think a lot of vegans get passionate about, yeah, no, the poor pigs and the poor cows should not be slaughtered, and we're treating them inhumanely, and you know, you don't have any moral right to be slaughtering them and eating them, and you have to stop. And I think they get just as zealous as some anti-abortion advocates who get militant as well. I kind of see it more in that line.
Okay. So can I just, sorry, Ben, guys, I'm not going to interrupt with you, but I just want to make an observation that I've been sitting up here is that, and this is specifically at Doug Reynolds. When I first came to this conference, we were talking about obesity and we were introducing the ketogenic diet to obesity. We slowly evolved into diabetes. And then in Seattle, it was about cardiac and LDL, and David Diamond and those guys were there. And it's amazing to look around today. Pretty much everybody over here, we've got everybody gave or has talked about the addictive side, the psychologic side. So we've got mental health worker, mental health talk, mental health worker, mental patient, mental health worker, mental health worker, all the way along. I mean, it's... So kudos to Doug for really being way at the forefront of what we do. So well done, Doug.
I just wanted to comment, having been through these wars for 50 years professionally, that we be careful that we don't become the zealots and the accusatory people, and the vegans are, you know, devils. Let's not get crazy with that, okay? Just a suggestion from a little history.
Yeah, and the reason I raise the question is this. I've observed a lot of people go carnivore, and all of a sudden their mood gets better, their depression, their anxiety. And that's been my biggest surprise in this realm. And I'm wondering why that is. Why it is that they get so much better, and I don't know if it's a universal thing, but almost everyone I've dealt with that went, and it may be because of the food addiction part of it, that it's not an option anymore to have those cookies or donut or whatever it is, but it may be that there's something stabilizing the brain function. Maybe it's the higher LDL, I don't know what it is, I've just observed it. So I don't know causation, but I'm observing it.
You know, there's one other factor here which we just can never lose sight of, which is there is a predatory addiction merchant industry out there. So we had an incredible presentation from Belinda Fettke in San Diego, where she talked about, I'll just say it, the Seventh-day Adventists who are behind the cereal manufacturers. So this is Kellogg's, and they're vicious. They're no different than the tobacco industry. They have an industry to protect. So they would be attacking keto, attacking carnivore, because these are unprocessed food plans. Yeah. I always just keep an eye on those folks.
Yeah.
Next question.
Yes, again, thanks for all the insights, especially with the metabolic syndrome and the mental issues. But Dr. Ben, you talked a little bit about why the super slow high intensity training is heart friendly. Would you explain that again a little bit? We got into the zone 2 and the cardiac. Thank you.
Just a little background. Brett and I are good friends. We've done projects together and stuff. And right after that talk, he sent me 3 references. Now, he had what he thought were reliable references. One of the references stated that resistance training was not as effective as aerobic training in reducing fat mass, okay? But I happen to know the study. I happen to know one of the principals, and one of the principals who presented that study said to me after that presentation there's no way in hell any amount of aerobic exercise is going to appreciably depreciate fat mass. Okay, I won't mention his name, but that's exactly what he said. So as far as cardiac function, the cardiac function is almost totally reliant on muscular demand. Okay, our cardiovascular system would not be able to pump blood at 10 times the normal rate if it wasn't for muscular demand in the developing species of humans. Okay, so what the muscle action actually produces the cardiac response. So if we recruit all of the muscle fibers, and that's what smart training does, we recruit up to these high intensity fibers. Even our aerobic oxidative fibers have to be working as hard as they can, or they would not recruit upwardly. So we're getting all of the benefits of aerobic training. And like I said, in a study that I did with 100 subjects, IRB study, 50 people did 3 hours and 20 minutes of about 85% max, which is supposed to be the cardiac zone, the fat burning zone. 3 hours and 20 minutes. The other group did 2 15-minute smart sessions. That's it. The cardio group produced an 11% increase in VO2 max, which is significant. The twice a week 15-minute group produced a 33% increase in VO2 max. Now I can go into why VO2 max is not necessarily a cardiac, but it is the gold standard for measuring cardiac efficiency. It's more of a local test, but be that as it may, that's the tool they gave me to identify. And so what happens is we're basically demanding, we're going through something called the Cori cycle, which is driving aerobic. There's a respiratory quotient between 7.0 is aerobic, 1.0 is completely glycolytic, okay, anaerobic. The closest any of us will ever get to a 7.0 purely aerobic state is during recovery from high intensity exercise. And there are mechanisms of end diastolic pressure and unloading peripherally, a bunch of stuff, but it is, I can go on, but needless to say, you can, given any test of aerobic capacity and cardiac function, this type of training now is being accepted more and more as the more beneficial, even in cardiac rehab. I don't know if I answered your question, but okay.
I'm curious about the panel's view on the field of fecal microbiota transplantation. As you guys know, and many in the audience know, the transplantation of from healthy donors to patients with C. diff caused some very strange things. Obesity was appearing or disappearing, mental disorders were appearing and disappearing. And then a year ago, I was perambulating across the internet, and to my shock and horror somewhat, people are doing this at home. And now I understand there's trials in Canada and Australia right now on FMT and mental disorders. So I'm curious about a plausible mechanism about how that might work, and what you think about if it can work.
So this one, so there's no doubt at this point, based on animal research, and that's animal research, so we don't know with certainty that it's going to apply to humans. There's no doubt based on the animal research that the gut microbiome does affect metabolism broadly. And it affects weight, it affects risk for diabetes, it affects risk for cardiovascular disease, and interestingly, as a side note, it also affects risk for mental disorders, but they're not metabolic. And so the mechanism is pretty clear, actually, but unfortunately there are like tens of thousands, if not more, variables, so we don't know how to make sense of it. But the mechanism is pretty clear. The bacteria in your gut eat what you eat. They eat it first. When they eat it, they process it. They actually turn some of the food they eat into neurotransmitters that get secreted, and those neurotransmitters get absorbed into our bloodstream and go throughout our body, including to our brain. The bugs also make things called neuropeptides. They make all sorts of chemicals, hormones, other things that are getting into our bloodstream and flowing through our body. That right now, there are trillions of microorganisms in all of our guts, tens of thousands of different species of microorganisms in our guts. Nobody has been able to make clear sense in humans which microorganisms are quote unquote good, which microorganisms are bad, or if it's a balance of organisms. So there's one paper that came out in a journal called Cell, which is one of the most reputable scientific journals in the world, about a year and a half ago, showing that there were 2 specific bacteria in mice that when they put mice on a ketogenic diet, it changed the microbiome. That change in the microbiome, they argued, was responsible for the anti-epileptic effect. They narrowed it down to 2 specific bacteria, not one. If you put either one, they would sterilize other mice guts and then put that one of those bacteria in, that didn't do it. They both bacteria had to be there at the same time. And then in these mice that had never done the ketogenic diet, they got at least somewhat of an anti-epileptic effect by having those 2 bacteria. Biotech companies have already aggressively pursued those 2 bacteria in humans. They don't do shit. So guess what? Literally and figuratively, because mice are not humans. And mice have a very different metabolism that probably responds somewhat differently to different hormones or neuropeptides or other factors. And so right now, what I can say is no one knows which ones it is. I will offer 2 concrete pieces of advice though. So one is that when I put people on the ketogenic diet, I specifically tell them do not take probiotics. Prebiotics are fine, but probiotics don't do it. And the reason I do that is because I've had 2 patients who were stable in ketosis. Both of them independently took different probiotics. They both were taken out of ketosis within 24 hours and became dramatically more symptomatic. That was enough. It's only 2. That's enough for me. I'm like, I don't need probiotics in my life anymore. And it goes to this notion that the gut microbiome is processing what we eat, and some of what that process may get turned into carbohydrates or may get turned into molecules that increase our insulin, even though it doesn't have carbohydrates. If you eat fiber, well, what are the bacteria doing with that fiber? And then what's happening to those products? We don't know right now. In terms of fecal transplant, there was a case at Mass General of a death, and this was somebody who was doing a study they got an antibiotic resistant strain of E. coli and they died. So doing a fecal microbial transplant at home is like having an abortion in the alley and you don't even need the abortion. Like it's just stupid. It is just stupid. It is dangerous. And so not that I have an opinion on it, but I think I would recommend against it.
Okay, kiss my butt. So I'm not going to answer the question, but I'm going to do a reference. I last week just did a 70-minute short interview with one of my heroes, Ivor Cummins. And Ivor is the fat emperor for people that don't know him, but mine was on exactly this topic. However, the more pertinent information was from a guy called Gabor Erdosi. And Gabor did 2 sessions with Ivor, and I would strongly encourage people to go back to those. It was particularly on this topic, and I took that to the next step with Ivor. But as a reference for the cardiologists in the room, for people who are interested in cholesterol, he just does phenomenal work, the Fat Emperor. But what Gabor did was looked at all of the biochemical science behind what you're talking about. And Gabor is a biochemist, he's not a doctor, but he'll go back and look at all these papers and evaluate them, and he uses his ability to critically review and objectively review this information and slowly. So he'll talk about fiber, he talks about the gut biome and all that kind of thing. So the answer is out there, but I think that the information is better presented on those podcasts. I learned a tremendous amount. But the best fecal transplant, and I do this on a regular basis because I kiss people's butts.
I cannot go further from what they say because it was better explained. But my take on it is on whom, for what have they done before? Is that their last resource? They've tried to do ketogenic diets, intermittent. What have they done before? Is the first step? So some other questions that I think that it's kind of like a side of it. But that's my take on it. I don't think it's necessary, but I think more research is necessary.
Just to allay your apprehensions, none of the animal studies were actually taking place in the animals' homes.
Yeah. And my opinion is just an opinion, but if you look at our body, we see you fast, your LDL goes up. You fast, your sugars go up. You know how our body is so adaptable. So I think our gut biome is going, the microbiome is going to change based on what we're eating. If we're eating a bunch of processed garbage that's not natural, it's not a human diet, we're gonna have more trouble. You go back to a real diet, I think you're gonna have some benefit. We have a lot of people, I'm not carnivore myself, but I see a lot of carnivores saying my gut problems went away, this went away, and I hear all this stuff. Either they're all making it up or there's something real, and I have a ton of people saying that, so maybe their gut biome, I don't know, that's what I'm saying. I don't know what's changing, but they're feeling better and their numbers are looking good and all that, so it may just be, I don't know if it's being carnivore or whether you're cutting out all the garbage, right? It's one of those things probably, or maybe a combination of those two.
Just one other note, there's a lot of concern in this community about keto flu, which from my perspective is actually a drug withdrawal syndrome from processed foods. But people wonder why they don't feel well for 4 days. And I think it's because a whole class of microorganisms are dying off in the gut and maybe releasing some toxicity while they're dying off. But there is research showing that it only takes 4 or 5 days to repopulate the gut when someone changes their diet. I use this to help parents help their kids, because I say to parents, if you get your kids off, or anybody that you want to help get onto a keto food plan or a clean food plan, take them off somewhere and just feed them clean food for 4 or 5 days. The microorganisms that break down processed foods will die off and be eliminated. And then when that kid tries to eat them again, there's nothing there to break it down. The liver has stopped storing the enzymes to break it down, so the full toxicity of the processed food will reach the brain. And people say that to me often, like, well, gosh, the last time I ate that, I was okay. This time it made me so sick. So this is one of the cool things about knowing body chemistry, is you can use that to help people understand what processed foods really do.
Thank you. You guys are great.
All right, in honor of not being super crazy, but I had to say this in honor of Tro. I am carnivore and I eat vegans. So no. And I'm joking, clearly.
What's wrong with that?
So my question is about the liver. Here's a pattern that I've seen in people stalling on keto. And it's kind of curious because they'll hit a stall and we'll see that even keeping their diet stable, we'll see their glucose numbers go up, their ketone levels come down for the morning numbers a bit. They're still in ketosis, they're not losing. And then what happens, it seems to be correlated. It's a few days, it's a variable, but then we'll see the glucose numbers drop back down, the ketone numbers roll back up, and whoosh, they'll drop a few pounds. And Dr. Cywes, I assume that that's the liver kind of just maybe depleting some older glycogen in the morning, in the dawn effect, as the liver's shrinking. And since you mentioned the shrinking, changing size of the liver, I guess I'm going to direct that to you.
Thank you. I think this is a very complex system. And for example, cortisol, if you haven't had enough sleep, if you went out and had a binge the night before, the interplay between all these hormones, we tend to highlight one. We tend to highlight blood sugar. We tend to highlight insulin. But glucagon, cortisol, your thyroid hormones, if you just think about one simple thing, a high insulin producing person who is in insulin resistance is blocking the entire androgenic and steroid hormone cascade. Insulin blocks the very first transformation of cholesterol downstream to important hormones. Cholesterol is a precursor. This is what we were talking about cholesterol earlier on. Everyone's so afraid of cholesterol. Here's what the human body does with cholesterol. It converts it to 6 important things. Estrogen in females, testosterone in males, T3, T4, vitamin D3, cortisol, and human growth hormone. And if you're blocking that enzymatic cascade because your insulin is up, and your insulin might have just bumped up by a little bit, now you've got deficits of all those hormones. Well, estrogen, testosterone distributes fat to various sites. Testosterone, that's testosterone. The fluffy fat that you have on the outside, that's estrogen. If my T3, T4 levels are lower, and my cortisol levels are lower, and my human growth hormone, that's inflammation, that's cancer, that's energy, perceived energy level, not caloric energy level. So the interplay between all of those, the hormonal milieu, is incredibly intense. The problem that I have with what you said is that people think about the ketogenic diet for weight loss, for a purpose. No, that is like the air we breathe. It is our normal state as omnicarnivores. And it's when we vary away from that that we get into trouble. So we are primarily designed to eat animals supplemented from time to time with plants. And that is the null hypothesis. And variations from that is the issue. So, for example, hunter-gatherers who pre-winter load up on carbohydrates to fatten up, there's a biological survival purpose for that. They tolerate a degree of insulin resistance. But that's a tolerance for a short period of time, and then the body is able to restore itself. So I think to look at this from a disease-curing perspective is different than looking at this from a restoration of normal. So that's, and there are variations in that normal. You got a diet, you're not going to lose weight all the time. And there's fluctuation. So weight loss, for example, is a stair-step pattern. It's not linear. And that's one of the key things to understand. And that's why I hate the scale as a metric. Because I can eat a tub of ice cream and my scale goes down. Ha, 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 look, I'm fine. I'm perfect. I go IF. I don't eat anything. I don't know how this is possible. And my weight goes up. Okay? So screw this. It doesn't work. It's so fickle. But if you think about it, it's the air that I breathe.
All right. Thank you very much.
So I have a question for anyone on the panel. In terms of biometrics and what we should be measuring, right? What would be your suggestions? I mean, we know glucose, we know ketones, your weight, your sleep, the calcium score. Any recommendations for other things to monitor and just kind of keep track of for your own health
hemoglobin
record?
A1C, I think fasting insulin for me, critical, because it tells me, you asked me if your LDL is bad, where's your insulin level? If it's super high, if it's 50, I'm stressed about your LDL cholesterol. If your insulin is down at 1 and you're super fit like Sean Baker, I'm not worried about it. It's going to be variable depending on that person and their lifestyle and what they have going on. So I think knowing the fasting is, for me, it's really, I'll give you an example. I had a guy who came in, Indian, worked for a big tech firm. Anyways, his dad has diabetes, brother has diabetes, runs in the family. Dad had a heart attack at a young age. So I get his A1C, and he knows this stuff because his family all has diabetes, 5.2. He goes, Doc, don't worry. And I look at his insulin level, 40. That's not good. So I tell him, I don't like that. That means your pancreas is kicking a lot of insulin to keep that A1C at 5.2. So I said, I want to see in 3 months, and let's see. And he's vegetarian, but he eats non-bread, rice, all this stuff is carbs, like mango with sugar on it, all that stuff. So 3 months later, A1C, 6.4. So he's one Twinkie away from diabetes now. If we waited a year and see in a year, he'd have full-blown diabetes and have that diagnosis the rest of his life, right? Once you get it, until we change the system, that's his diagnosis. So he's like, oh my gosh, cuts his carbs, now he's back to 5.2 with a normal insulin, right? So making those, that was critical, because if I said your A1C is 5.2, that's what's happening to a lot of us. We say your A1C is good, fine. And then the other thing is when we see our triglycerides really high, the LDL is low, Dave Feldman has shown this over and over, is you're falsely reassuring yourself. you have metabolic disease, right? No matter what your LDL, we're all looking, your LDL's fine, you're good, go ahead. So I'm saying you have to look at the whole picture, and I think that's one thing I really like to focus on.
One thing I would like to add to what Dr. Cywes said is the concept of keto readaptation, because we are normally from birth adapted to ketosis. So somehow the concept of keto adaptation, it's like, okay, I'm adapting to something that I have to, that's a challenge for me because I have to adapt for something that is, I was not born into, but the readaptation or reintegration into ketosis, I think it's, I know it's semantics, but these are important semantics. Mm-hmm. The same thing that I have like a personal thing, and that I hope I live to see a time that my diet is not described as what I don't eat, or like if low carb, I hope someday it's become adequate carbs or normal carb. You know, it's like low carb is kind of like we are detached from what's normal. So I know that it is very important in order to move forward, but these semantics for me are, as a psychiatrist, always important.
It's a paradigm
it's just
shift.
a little add.
And in terms of testing the insulin, then that insulin level, what would be, because that's the harder test, right? It's not something that's
Insulin?
just the
Fasting is the best return on investment.
So just to come back to that, we order, when I first see patients, a broad spectrum of labs on patients. And the reason I do that is not to treat, at least not to treat the numbers. I do it as a baseline. Mm-hmm. And I've got inflammatory markers, I've got lipid markers, I've got diabetic markers, I've got glucagons, I've got estrogens, I've got testosterone, I've got PSA, I've got the whole gamut. And I do that as a baseline. The single best therapy, the single best treatment I can give a patient is a ketogenic diet. And so we put them on the ketogenic diet, and I'll go through, the second time I see them, I'll go through the numbers and say, look, these are the markers that are wrong, and this is the story, this is how they became that way. And then we re-measure them a few months down the road once they've had that treatment, and we compare them. So it's not about one number. We measure a thyroid number, oh, it's bad, we've got to treat your thyroid. Now, if someone's got Hashimoto's, that's fine, but for the most part, the metabolically deranged patients that I see can be treated most effectively with a ketogenic diet, and then you treat what's left afterwards. Obviously, there's some caveats to that, but to my mind, it's a continuum of change rather than one number that you're treating at any one time. Yeah, and that for me is important. Now, you can use that as a baseball bat as well. Look, dude, your A1C is 8.0. If you don't do this, we're going to have to start some horrible diabetic medication. You know, you should have started your patient at 6.4 on metformin or something, but you didn't. You put him on a ketogenic diet, and his A1C came back down to 5.2. That's the best treatment, because you put him on metformin. You know what the treatment criteria for diabetes is by the ADA? They diagnose at 6.5, but their recommendation is you're healthy if your A1C is below 7. You know, it's that, but so we can't treat to those standards. So I use this as a weapon with my patients, and also just to track change over time.
And that's what I would be interested in, is knowing what does that panel look like, right? And the second question to that is, what amount of time do you give? Like, let's say someone, you know, they do their test, they have all their numbers. Is it 3 months? And that's assuming they're adhering to it, right? They're compliant. 3 months, 6 months?
It depends on the severity of the disease. A1C takes 3 months to come down. It's the lifespan of a red blood cell. So, but there's also nuances. For example, Brian gave a great talk on de-prescribing. If I'm de-prescribing, I want to know those numbers more quickly. Yeah. If I can possibly get a CGM or some sort of regular monitor for those patients, that's an ideal. That's going to give me information. So if it's just a fat person whose numbers are a little bit off, that's different to a person that's had 3 heart attacks and is in trouble. So I can't give you a specific frequency, but for the most part, it's about every 3 months. And part of it also is these tests cost a ton of money. So I can manage a person who doesn't have insurance with very, very little in terms of biochemical management, lab test management. It really is the principles of the therapy.
Great, thank you very much.
There are 3 metrics that I think health professionals don't tend to check for, which have a profound impact on health. And they are, is the person being abused at home? 1/3 of people who suffer from obesity are being abused at home. Are they lonely? Lonely is a big stressor in a person's life. And how much time are they spending on screens, which also have a hugely detrimental impact on health?
And I think looking at the markers also, because if someone's not losing weight, like some people, I have friends who they went 4 months and lost 2 pounds and like, this isn't working. But when you see your insulin drop in half, you see your triglycerides drop by 200 points, you see your HDL going way up, feel a lot better about what you're doing rather than saying, I'm not getting any results, forget it. Because that's the big thing we see. And that's why I love what Ben's doing is, hey, if we could stimulate some of those, you know, get you a little bit more insulin sensitive, drop that insulin level down, make your body more insulin. Because I think that's where Ben Bickman says that's where it comes down to. Make your body as sensitive to insulin as you can. So when you see that insulin coming down, you feel good about it, even if you only lose. I have a lady, she reversed tons of stuff. She lost 5 pounds in 2 months or something like that. And sleep got better, sweating, anxiety, everything got better. But she goes, I only lost 5 pounds, so I stopped. Like, all your stuff got better, so you stop because it's a sacrifice. And there's addiction. There's a lot of factors that we don't understand yet. But when you can show someone, say, look, your numbers are getting better. Let's keep plugging along, you know.
I do have a question, but I just want to say that those labs in my office are $30 or less.
Yeah.
Direct primary care. So my question, I think anyone could probably answer, but mostly it's mental health and de-prescribing. So first, has anyone ever de-prescribed a thyroid medication? That's one. And then two, because I'm an addiction specialist and I end up with a lot of people with polypharmacy on potentially addictive medications or what we call scheduled drugs. And as hard as opioids are to come off, benzos are very hard to come off, gabapentin is very hard to come off. Even antidepressants, I've seen people struggle to come off of antidepressants because of brain zaps and so forth. So I'm just wondering if anyone has any suggestions on how to help people with those types of medicines that are particularly hard to stop, and if there's any research ongoing about keto and that potentially being helpful for people who are on multiple medications that affect the brain.
So great question. And the easy answer is with almost all psychotropic medications, every single one of them have withdrawal syndromes. The ones that take a few weeks to start working actually tend to be a lot worse than the short-acting ones. So stimulants and benzos are easier to get people off of, quite honestly, in my opinion. The antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, which take a few weeks to ramp up, are much more difficult to get people off of. So you can stop it right away, but there's a high risk, like if you stop an antipsychotic right away, there's a high risk within the next month your patient's gonna be hospitalized. And so the rule of thumb is to taper everything. Nothing I guess it depends on how long they've been on it. So let me back up and start with that. So if they've been on it for 6 months or less, yeah, maybe you can stop it cold turkey, whatever it is. If they've been on it for, more than 2 years, you're gonna have to do a taper, and probably a really slow taper. How much of a taper? Totally depends. You wing it. You really wing it. But you have a conversation with the patient that this is gonna be difficult to get you off of. We're gonna have to be in close contact. Let's try to reduce it by 25% or 50% or whatever you wanna do as the initial target. But if you start having symptoms within 2 days or 3 days, go right back up, especially if those symptoms are unmanageable. If the symptoms are just noticeable but you can manage, let's tough it out, but stay in touch, because I can't tell you how many times over my career, whether doing keto or not, I've seen people hospitalized because they came off of meds too fast. So in terms of the question of can keto counteract medication withdrawal, I have a very clear, unequivocal answer. No. The keto medication withdrawal, psychiatric medication withdrawal versus the ketogenic diet is no match whatsoever. I was hoping it would be early on when I was treating patients. I have been burned way too many times. And I have to tell you, I've been burned with patients that, one recent patient, she was desperate to get off her meds, was still psychotic, had a chronic psychotic disorder, also a lot of mood symptoms, suicidality, put her on the ketogenic diet. 2 months later, markedly improved. That paranoia was almost completely gone. No other psychotic symptoms, no suicidality, mood was better than she could ever remember. Parents confirmed this, other treaters involved in her case confirmed this. We were all unanimous. She's so much better. Her goal was to get off meds. We started tapering, all hell broke loose. She ends up in the hospital. They don't support the ketogenic diet there. She's now off the ketogenic diet. She's floridly psychotic. They're adding multiple antipsychotics now. They're adding all sorts of shit. And she's still hospitalized in a mess. Yeah. So my protocol now, if you're going to use the ketogenic diet with somebody with a serious chronic psychiatric disorder, put them on the ketogenic diet, assess for an effect within 3 months. If they get that effect, tell them tough it out for another 3 months on your meds, and then maybe we will slowly but surely try to taper you.
Great. Just to add, what I see in my subset of patients, my population of patients, first of all, I talk with them in regards to what's the goal, okay? My goal with my patients is for them to have to see an improvement in their quality of life, whether it is with or without medications. The goal is not to get off medications or be on a medication. So that being said, depends what type of drugs. If it's an antidepressant, you have to assess all of the aspects, like for how long they have been taking it, what were the conditions for what it was prescribed, if the person is stable, what are the goals of taking it out, predisposition, because the toughest hurdle that I see with these patients is sometimes they have an anxiety disorder. If that's the case, the number one fear is the relapse. Okay, they go back to those horrible symptoms that they convey to me. So I say horrible because they've probably been traumatized because of those anxiety spells, and they don't want to go back. So I do a careful assessment of how they were when they were prescribed the medication, if it wasn't me. So I do a careful assessment of that, and I try to go back and forth to what they've accomplished during the treatment plan, because that's the goal of a psychiatric treatment, to work with the patient, maybe with a psychotherapy, where a psychotherapist also, and doing other things, incorporating mindfulness, getting outside, cultivating better habits, better relationships. If the patient has done all that, it is a perfect moment to do a balance of the treatment. And maybe if there's a good predisposition, what I see that I don't have many problems in tapering them off slowly, so they don't feel many symptoms during the detitration. But sometimes they just want to do it more faster, and I just walk with them. I meet them where they're at, and I also have the same experience as him, that benzos if they want to get off them, I find that they can tough it out, and I've seen good results with that, and that is very gratifying. And during university and during my residency, I've got too little education on how to de-prescribe, and too much information on how to prescribe. So that's an imbalance that I hope that
we all did.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and one thing I would add, you're an addiction specialist, so obviously, I think the point you made, if they want to get off.
Right.
Most
Well,
most patients
totally.
in your addiction practice don't want to
Yeah.
get off benzos. They might say they might say they do. They might be going along with it, but they kind of really don't. At least not really. So so as soon as you try to taper, as soon as you start to taper them, they're going to have withdrawal symptoms. There's no way around it. They will.
Right.
We have to believe that and honor that. But they're going to overreact with you. Doctor, oh my God, you got to put me back up. I need more. I need something else. I need, and then you have to decide, are you going to be the really tough addiction doctor and force them off? Or are you going to make them go in for a detox? Or what are you going to, like,
I know. Everybody's just taking or replacing the benzos with gabapentin now. That's what I'm seeing, and there's problems with that.
And just so you know, gabapentin is an anti-epileptic treatment, and you're using it
Right.
off-label.
Yeah. I know.
One more thing, I find that it's a perfect moment to be more adamant about physical activity because it's the perfect anxiolytic. So
Sure.
it's a good, if they say, okay, that's a very good way to modulate how they are feeling, because that's a natural way in which we discharge stress. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Just to add to that, one of the key things when you're de-prescribing is we have so little knowledge. I mean, you look at normal numbers, normal range. Normal ranges were created on the standard American diet. So to have a normal range of insulin from, 3 to 19 or 3 to 26, that's garbage. I use my normal range of insulin is below 4. Okay, A1C, my normal range of A1C is 4.9 to 5.2. It's not 5.7. I call that person diabetic. So, my heart rate is 48, 50, 49. I go to my cardiologist. I don't have one. But I go to a cardiologist, and I'm going to walk out with a pacemaker because I've got sick sinus syndrome or whatever. So we've really got to look at normal tables and how they play in. So part of it also is looking at the interplay of numbers. Thyroid hormone we de-prescribe thyroid medication quite readily. I'm not going to go to the psych meds, that's above my pay grade. But the question is, are they on a T3 drug or a T4 drug? And you want to look at T4 numbers as well as T3 numbers. So we were talking about blood work before. Those patients you want to track at least every 2 or 3 weeks as you slowly wean them. And you've got to look at TSH, you've got to look at T3, you've got to look at T4. The interplay is important, and you've got to make sure they're on a ketogenic diet, because everything goes out the window if they're not. So it's very complex. PPIs is another one. We stop those pretty readily. I don't call it stopping. I call it a drug holiday. Come off it for a week or two. If your symptoms come back, we can put you back on that medication. Just my personal experience with my patients, and it's not me de-prescribing, it's them. A number of my patients are on this awful medication, at least in my experience, called Cymbalta. Now, Cymbalta, I didn't know this, but it comes in a capsule and it's got granules in it. And I've got patients who every day take out 1 extra granule. And they say if they take out more than that, they feel awful the next day. It's amazing how patients will de-prescribe for themselves. But the one thing I'll tell you is there are very few medications that should be stopped. They should all be weaned slowly. And you want somebody else and yourself to tell you how you're doing.
Right.
Because it's not just the numbers that we measure, it's how do you feel? And those are important things.
Yeah, and one other thing I'd throw in on that line is, I interviewed Siobhan Huggins, who does a lot with Dave Feldman, a lot of these crazy experiments. She was carnivore. She had a long history of depression and anxiety. This is public. We talked about it. Mood stable for, I want to say 3 or 4 years. Don't quote me on it, but a long time. Then she did an experiment on a high-carb diet for 8 days. Went into major depression, and she said it was hard she was craving food and all that. And then when you get into that depressive state, now you want to eat carbs. And so she said it was hard for someone who knows her stuff to come back on. And I think that's a cautionary tale for those of us who go on a cruise and say, okay, I'm on a cruise, I'm going to live it up. And then you start dealing with all these depression, anxiety. I think there has to be something to that with the inflammation of the brain and hormone fluxes and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, well, Brian spoke too long again, so. No, so listen, normally I make this thing 2 hours long, but we had with my fault, I invited too many speakers. So we had to put an extra speaker in this afternoon, and so this is only an hour instead of 2 hours. I promise you next time I'll make it a 2-hour session again. But we've got 5 or 6 minutes left, so one more question. If you guys can keep an eye on the clock and make sure that you keep your things quick, and then we'll do the raffle, and we need to get out of here. Okay.
I'll make this quick. I want to thank Doug and Pam for not only a fantastic conference this weekend, but for creating a low-carb community for all of us. And my question for you is, how are you supported and helped by your own low-carb communities?
It's easy for me. I'm in San Diego, so we do low-carb meetups once a month. We do a lot of stuff in the community. I do some speaking just to help people understand what we're talking about, you know. And the exciting thing is, 3 years ago when I started doing this stuff, no one knew what keto was. Now I hear people like, they'll show something on their show, that's not keto, that's not low carb, and it's amazing how much has changed in just a few years. I've been looking at that. So yeah, there's a lot happening in San Diego, which is exciting. Yeah.
In South America, we have here the Argentinian, Chilean team. And cheers. Last November, there was the first keto gathering in Santiago. Mike Matzo was there, Ryan Lowry was there, I was there, Miriam Calamian was there, and it was a wonderful event. They were there also, and really, I see this really moving forward. We are all connected through the internet, through the social media. That's the most powerful thing that I've seen. And building community in the social media has been very comforting, because when at least from my perspective, when I started, I always told Doug that I felt kind of like isolated because we didn't know each other. I have a WhatsApp group with a lot of professionals from Argentina, Spain, Chile, Venezuela, and really it's different ways, and which I'm for sure, this is moving forward.
I think having been in this game plan since the early 90s, one of the things that I've found is that communities will come and go, but really the traction, and it's a migration that we've made, and it came from one particular point. About 2 or 3 months ago, we've been trying to get media exposure for what we do for a long, long time, and it's impossible. We just can't get in front of mainstream TV. As expert as we are, Steve Finney, the gods of what we do that have got all the knowledge, cannot do that. About 2 or 3 months ago, a 26-year-old woman by the name of Alyssa Parker, who is an Instagrammer. She has a few million followers. She was a militant vegan who went carnivore in a couple of days and said how wonderful it feels. She picked up a whole segment on Fox News. So what I've realized is that knowledge is irrelevant in the current environment. Yeah. What is relevant is getting out there and stimulating people to try what we do. Sean Baker is an orthopedic surgeon, okay? He's done nothing with bones and joints. His whole thing is eating venison joints and ribeyes. That's how, and Sean has got these massive followings on social media. So I think more and more the influence that we're gonna have, because we don't have a James Cameron that can shoot a Game Changers to sell pea protein to people. We don't have that. So it really is using social media, using the network, using that medium rather than science. And it's a very, very sad day that I say that. But ultimately, that's the message.
I just want to chime in that I got on NPR and it went nationwide, and WebMD did an article on nutritional psychiatry and included me in ketogenic diet. So we can get ourselves into mainstream media as long as we stay science-based.
Let him get one question in.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you guys, because I don't know if you really know that you actually do change lives of the people here. I mean, I've been here since the very beginning, and so I know Doug pretty well. I want to specifically thank Dr. Ben, Body by Ben, over the years since last year. Joan's Processed Foods, she's the one who began the addiction sort of theme going around. And I think we all built on that. It's like her thoughts are still rattling around. And Dr. Palmer or Chris, your life is as exciting as it gets in terms of your work. And it's like, I follow it, and I'm sure other people, you send chills down their spine. So I wanted to thank you for that. My question was briefly, and maybe you don't have time to answer it, where do you stand on nutritional deficiencies? And what I mean is, so you have a person, so we can all be genomically limited somehow. We also can have a poor diet somehow. We also can be on medications that create nutritional deficiency. So where do you put that as a, if not causative, such a high contribution that it can be addressed that may change a lot of these things? This is even before keto. Keto I'm obviously with, but it's been important in my life and important in how I see things. And it's just not serum. There's a lot of ways you can chase it, so I'll leave that part out. But you can measure it. You can, if one wants to. Do you see that as relevant? Or we'll get to it when we get to it. It's just not on the table because it's too minor of a topic. You follow what I'm saying?
Well, when you take someone off of a processed food plan or diet, they will correct nutritional deficiencies. You know, obesity is characterized by nutritional deficiencies. So one thing to do is at least to wait 6 months after somebody's improved their diet, because those are expensive tests, and they're going to change radically.